next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And say good morning to Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for calling in.
Well, it's nice to be here on a snowy morning.
Yeah, how much snow over there in Alfred at this point in the day?
Well, I'd say about 2 inches, maybe 3, about 2 inches or so. But it's still coming down a little bit, and I think we're going to get a little bit more. So stay indoors, or at least don't do too much driving. I was on my way to Olean early this morning, and I had to turn back because of the conditions on Route 244. It may be a little better now, but yeah, I think that caution is in order.
Well, thanks for that tip, Dr. Ostrower, on driving safely this morning because of the roads. Well, with so many things to talk about, let's start out with Nancy Pelosi. It looks like she's going to get that House Speaker's job. Well,
she probably will get that House Speaker's job. There were 17 Democrats who had signed a letter to the effect that they would not support her. And while one of them has clearly, peeled off, the others are beginning to soften their tone, and that really means that, she pretty much has a lock on this position. The main problem for those who oppose her is that there is no one who is going to step into her place. No one has been willing to say that he or she will serve as Speaker, will like to challenge her as Speaker. There had been one woman, a woman by the name of Fudge from, I believe, Ohio, who had indicated that she would challenge Pelosi, but the two of them made some kind of a deal, and it would appear that Pelosi is picking off these 17 one by one, calling them, making some promises, and promises, for instance, of giving, in one case, providing one congresswoman a committee chairmanship having to do with electoral reform. And that woman is now saying, all right, she'll support Pelosi. So, the Speaker has a lot of weapons, a lot of arrows in that quiver, and she's going to use them. She's very, very experienced, and as I said, most importantly, no one at this point, has indicated publicly that he or she is going to be a challenger. So Pelosi will become the next Speaker. By the same token, I might add that some of what she is doing, she is making concessions, Pelosi. For instance, Brian Higgins, who is a congressman from Buffalo, has gotten her to agree to, number one, have a debate on the subject of allowing people over 50 years old to buy into Medicare. That is one of Brian Higgins' aims, to have, basically to expand the Medicare program. He's also gotten her to indicate a willingness to allow discussion of a $1 trillion infrastructure program. And, that means that Brian Higgins is going to support her. By the same token, it means that, many of the more liberal Democratic aims are going to be, they're certainly going to be, they're going to become very much a part, I think, of the Democratic program over the next year or so, at least in the House of Representatives. Now, whether they will get any support at all in the Senate remains to be seen. But Trump himself had said when he was running for president that he would support an infrastructure program. So, it's entirely possible that some of this is going to be realized in the next year or two.
Interesting watching Congressman Tom Reed on this one. At first, Reed was saying that Pelosi doesn't have the numbers. Then Reed switched, I think because the president did, and Reed said he would support Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, I suppose he will. It's hard to say. I don't know exactly what Tom is doing in respect to the Pelosi business. If Nancy Pelosi has to get a majority, a simple majority of support in the new Congress on January 2nd or January 3rd, whenever they meet. If she can't do that, then of course there will be a contest. And in that case, she would need Republican support. Now, what the price of that Republican support is going to be, the price that will be demanded by people like Tom Reed, remains to be seen. We don't know anything. We haven't heard anything about that at this point. But I would think that one of the things that we're going to find is that the Problem Solvers Caucus, and remember, that Problem Solvers Caucus, of which Reed helped to found, and he's one of the chairs of it, one of the two chairs, is a bipartisan group. And they are demanding certain kinds of things that really are not going to make page one of the newspaper, but are nevertheless important. For instance, the problem solvers, the Democratic members of the Problem Solvers Caucus, have essentially said to Nancy Pelosi that if she wants their support, and they're probably going to get it, okay, if she wants their support, she will allow bills that get over 290 sponsors, so that's not only Democrats but Republicans as well, to come to the floor for a vote in the House of Representatives. They're also demanding, for instance, that she allow bills that get at least one co-sponsor from each, one at least on the Democratic side, at least one on the Republican side, to at least get a committee hearing. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it will get to the floor of the House, but there is going to be some kind of a hearing. They're also demanding that she allow that bills that get at least 20 co-sponsors from each party will get a hearing and a vote, which means, in other words, that the power of the Speaker, which is very, very great right now. I think that there are a lot of Congress people on both sides of the aisle who are, kind of resentful of the degree to which the Speaker of the House of Representatives can determine, in a monopoly sort of fashion, whether a bill is going to be heard or whether it's not going to be heard on the floor of the House of Representatives. That power, I think, is going to be diminished. And if Pelosi really is agreeing to these things, I think we're going to have a more democratic, and I mean it with a small d, with a lowercase d, a more democratic House of Representatives than we have had in the last 20 or 30 years.
Interesting observations on the Problem Solvers Caucus, and we'll see, because that's an organization that Congressman Tom Reed helped to found. Lots of news going on Eastern Europe area this morning. Ukraine has declared martial law, and wanted to get your thoughts on that whole situation with the Russian-Ukraine Navy clash.
Well, hard to know exactly what to make out of it. Most Americans are completely unaware of what's happening in that little corner of the world. I guess you have to know a little bit of geography here to fully understand what's happening. The Black Sea is basically a Russian sea, but jetting into the Black Sea is that area called Crimea. And the Crimea is part of Ukraine. But the Crimea also has been claimed by Russia as Russian rather than as Ukraine. So there's a dispute. And a few years ago, about 4 to 5 years ago, the Russians quite literally sent their army into Crimea, and they've taken over it. They occupy the Crimea right now. The Ukrainians are not exactly very happy about this thing. So there's not only an issue over the Crimea, but there's also an issue in which the Russians are seeking to expand their influence into the eastern section of Ukraine. So it's a fundamentally unstable situation. Ukraine is a relatively small country compared to Russia. They have a relatively small army compared to the Russians. If there is a military clash, the Ukrainians are going to get crushed. On the other hand, nationalism sometimes leads people to do things that is not necessarily in their interest. And what I'm concerned about is that if there is, in fact, more of a clash, because there really was, I mean, the Russians fired on Ukrainian ships. Quite a number of Ukrainian sailors were injured. I don't think that any were killed, but a number were injured. And the situation is not settling down right now. And, my concern is that sometimes small conflicts develop into big conflicts. And if anyone wants a little evidence of that, just go back and take a look at what happened in 1914, when what looked to be a fairly minor squabble between Serbia on one hand and Austria-Hungary on the other, within a period of approximately 2 months, had become a world war. Okay? In other words, that local issue had brought in the Russians on one side, and then the Germans on the other side, and then the French on that original side, and the English and so forth, and pretty soon all of Europe was at war. Well, these things sometimes get out of hand, and that could happen here. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. That's very important. But by the same token, NATO has been very supportive of Ukrainian independence in respect to the degree to which the Russians have tried to dominate that region.
Looking here on Twitter this morning, and a diplomat named Kurt Volker put up a post on Twitter. It said, Russia rams Ukrainian vessel peacefully traveling towards a Ukrainian port. Russia seizes ships and crew and then accuses Ukraine of provocation?
Well, hey, when it comes to the beginning of conflicts, countries are not always very honest, so to speak. And of course, the Russians are going to blame the Ukrainians. I don't think we have to take that seriously. What we do have to take seriously is the fact that the Russians have, in fact, initiated hostilities. Now, whether the hostilities will grow, whether they will expand, is anyone's guess right now. My hunch is that it will not. I don't think the Russians really want a war out of this, and the Ukrainians know that they're not going to win a contest if it becomes military. On the other hand, the Ukrainian president is a very unpopular president. There's going to be an election this next year in 2019, and it's entirely possible that he will seek to expand this whole issue as a way of gathering domestic support against the Russians. So, in other words, political considerations may interfere with, what otherwise would be kind of military and diplomatic considerations.
Now, another name that's coming up on Twitter in connection to this is a Donald Tusk, a Polish politician who's in charge of the European Council. And Tusk says he condemns Russian use of force. Russian authorities must return Ukrainian sailors, vessels, and refrain from further provocations. Tusk says he discussed the situation with the president of the Ukraine and will meet with his representatives. Europe will stay united in support of Ukraine. How much weight does that carry, do you think, Dr. Gary Ostrower?
For the Russians, I think it carries zero weight. I think the Russians could not care less about what the Poles are saying. By the same token, the Poles, again, on the Russian border, a lot less powerful in any kind of traditional military terms than is Russia. The Poles have to worry about Russian expansionism, just as the Ukrainians are worried about Russian expansionism. So I'm not surprised that a Polish politician would be offering support to the Ukrainians at this point. But what that really means in respect to Russian ambitions, I don't have a clue. I will say this again, and I'm saying this as a historian. The Russians have had an interest in this area. The Russians have had an interest in controlling the entire Black Sea, which means, in other words, entry into the Mediterranean, going all the way back to the 17th century. So, that interest, if you will, has been around for a long, long time, and that's not going to change. To the extent, in other words, that the Ukrainians may appear to frustrate that interest, I think we're going to see continued tension between both Russia on one hand and Ukraine and the Ukraine on the other.
It's Tuesday, November 27th. A lot of interesting stuff happened in this day in history. Dr. Ostrower, we're going to take a quick break and then check the forecast. And we'll ask Rob Carolyn what he thinks about snow for Alfred. But do you mind if we do a little history when we come back?
Sure.
We'll be back in just a moment.
It's a Black Friday sales event at Maple City Dodge. Gary's clearing the lot, making great deals. Check out the 2018 Jeep Renegade Latitude 4x4 with up to $6,000 in savings. Select models and trims. Some restrictions apply. Great lease specials, too. Ask about lease specials on the 2018 Pacifica Touring L or the 2019 Ram 1500 Bighorn Crew Cab 4x4. Stop into Maple City Dodge in Hornell, where you get the real deal every time.
Checking in with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Rob, National Weather Service calling for 5 to 9 inches of snow for Allegheny County. How about the Alfred area?
It looks like by the time it's all said and done, Brian, Alfred may check in with about 3 to 6 inches of snow. What's going to be causing this is an upper-level low-pressure system that's going to help crank out some lake effect precipitation. We're already seeing some snow downwind of Lake Erie this morning, and most of the warnings are from Allegheny back across Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, and into southern Erie counties. They're going to see some spots of Chautauqua, southern Erie could pick up over a foot. It's the first decent lake effect storm we've been talking about so far this season. Being further east, the snowfall a little bit lighter here, but we will see some flurries and snow showers today. The further west you live, the more likely you are to see an inch or two. It'll be breezy 35 to 40. Sunrise this morning was at 7:16. The sun will set tonight at 4:40. We'll see scattered snow showers tonight, an inch or two possible. Again, western areas have the best chance of that inch or two. Overnight lows near 30. Tomorrow, breezy with scattered snow showers, another inch or two possible. Temperatures up to about 35 to 40, and it'll be mostly cloudy with light flurries and snow showers Thursday. Highs on Thursday, Brian, 35 to 40 degrees.
Well, back with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. On this day in history, 1965, Pentagon calls for troop increase. The Pentagon informs President Lyndon Johnson that if General Westmoreland is to conduct a major sweep operations necessary to destroy enemy forces during the coming year, again 1965, U.S. troop strength should be increased from 120,000 to 400,000 men. Dr. Ostrower.
Well, first of all, I think our listeners should know that you do not clear these questions with me before the program. So I feel as if I'm taking an exam right now. Fortunately, at least I think on this one I know the answer to the question. On July 28th of 1965, okay, which is about 5 months earlier than than what we're talking about right now. On July 28th, President Johnson made a decision to essentially Americanize the Vietnam War. In other words, until July of 1965, yes, the United States was involved in some limited bombing of North Vietnam. The United States had, some thousands of military advisors in Vietnam, and by that time we had sent some of the Marines into the area around Da Nang, which is the second largest city in Vietnam, where there's a very, very large airport, to defend the airport and to do some what we call search and destroy operations against the Viet Cong. In other words, the guerrillas in the southern part of the country that were harassing the government. But the South Vietnamese government was not a very effective government. The South Vietnamese army was losing the fight against the Viet Cong, and it was on that basis that on July 28th, President Johnson announced the decision to put in an additional 75,000 troops. Now, that's a lot of men. And that essentially took a war that was in large measure being fought by the South Vietnamese and turned it into a war that was being fought by, well, yes, the South Vietnamese, but increasingly by the Americans. By November, President Johnson had made the decision that even that additional 75,000 would not be sufficient. And therefore, he made exactly the announcement that you are, or at least the Department of Defense made the request that you're referring to here. And I guess the larger point that I would make about this is that it kind of helps us, reinforce something I had said earlier when we were talking about Russia and the Ukraine, namely that small wars sometimes become big wars. There's a kind of logic. You don't want to admit that you have made a mistake. You don't want to admit that, what you have done is really not sufficient. And so you you throw bad money or good money after bad money. And in this case, we know what eventually happened. Those 400,000 troops eventually became 547,000 troops. And it was still not enough to win the war. I was listening the other day to another guest on your program, Mr. Wlea from Alfred State College, who had made the point that the United States won the war. Militarily, we won the war. That's just not true. That is simply not true. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong lived there. They were going to be there for a long, long time. And they understood something that President Johnson never fully grasped, and that is that the Vietnam War was as much a political war as it was a military war. So that however many military victories and conventional battles the U.S. might win, or did win, as a matter of fact, such as even during the Tet Offensive, the fact of the matter is that the enemy was not going to go away. They were going to outlast us, and of course they did exactly that. Under Democratic presidents like Johnson, under Republican presidents like President Nixon, they were there to stay. And it was a very, very unhappy experience for all of us.
Down to the last 3 minutes, Dr. Ostrower. I'll let you pick the topic. We can either talk about Khashoggi or another this day in history question.
Well, let's talk about Khashoggi for a moment. Here again, I was listening to Dr. Heinemann, who was on Friday's Newsmaker program, and he had made the point that Trump is absolutely right about Khashoggi, namely that, Khashoggi really means nothing to the United States, and we can't give up our relationship with the Saudi Arabians because the Saudi Arabians, who are responsible for the murder of Khashoggi, nevertheless supply us with oil. They purchase many of our weapons. They therefore create jobs in the United States, and yet, from my perspective, that really misses the point, because by essentially saying that we're going to allow the Saudi Arabians to get away with what they did by killing an American resident, okay, not a citizen, but an American resident who is also a reporter for the Washington Post, by saying that they can do that in another country, in this case in Turkey, that they can do that means that any other country can do much the same thing, so long as that other country is providing the U.S. with jobs or with money, with revenue, with arms, whatever it might be. I think it's a terrible, terrible precedent. It's going to make a much more chaotic international world, the kind of international chaos that I'm going to argue led to both World War I and also led to World War II. In other words, I think what President Trump is doing is creating a much more dangerous environment. And that's why I think so many people, and not just liberals in this country, but many, principal conservatives as well, are really quite furious that the president is allowing the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince, to get away with what apparently he had ordered.
Dr. Ostrower, we're going to have to leave it there. As always, thanks for coming on and combining history with current events. As always, a great show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and stay warm, folks.